The Boeing 737 shook through moderate turbulence somewhere over Nevada, and nobody in coach paid any attention to the man in 12F. He wore a faded denim jacket, reading glasses perched on his nose, absorbed in a dog-eared paperback about the Korean War. His carry-on bag contained a Spider-Man lunchbox, a juice box, and a permission slip he'd forgotten to sign. Daniel Hargrove looked exactly like what he was, a tired single father flying home from his daughter's school conference in Phoenix, counting down the hours until he could collapse on his couch and pretend he had his life together. The flight attendant offered him pretzels. He smiled politely and declined. 2 rows back, a teenager played a mobile game too loudly. Across the aisle, a businessman typed furiously on a laptop. The mundane symphony of commercial aviation continued without interruption, each passenger locked in their own small world, unaware that the man in 12F had once controlled the most lethal aircraft ever built, or that his call sign was spoken with reverence in ready rooms across 3 continents. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, apologizing for the chop, promising smoother air ahead. Daniel checked his watch. Another 90 minutes to Sacramento. His ex-wife would have Emma ready at the curb per their agreement. No conversation, no lingering, just a quick handoff and the return to his 1-bedroom apartment where dinosaur drawings covered the refrigerator and macaroni was considered gourmet. He'd left that other life behind 6 years ago, walked away from the cockpit, from the brotherhood, from the adrenaline that made his hands shake and his heart soar. He'd chosen his daughter over the sky. He'd chosen bedtime stories over combat air patrols, and he'd made peace with that choice, or so he told himself during the long nights when the silence pressed too heavy, and the ceiling became a canvas for memories he couldn't quite bury. Then the radio frequency shifted, bleeding through the aircraft's speakers with a sound that made Daniel's spine straighten involuntarily. Not the captain's voice anymore. Something military. Something urgent. A fighter pilot's clipped transmission, tight with controlled aggression. Southwest 473, this is Venom, lead on guard. Squawk 7700 immediately and maintain current heading. Do not deviate. Do not respond on this frequency. Acknowledge with ident only. The cabin fell silent. Even the teenager's game stopped. The businessman's fingers froze above his keyboard. Daniel Hargrove's hand moved without conscious thought to his hip, reaching for a stick that wasn't there, his eyes already calculating angles and altitudes, and threat assessments that his body remembered better than his mind wanted to admit. Through the window to his right, 30 degrees high, 2 specks resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of F-22 Raptors, flying formation tight enough to make the distance between them a matter of faith and skill. The captain's voice returned, stripped of its casual professionalism, replaced by something Daniel recognized immediately as suppressed fear. Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. We're being escorted by military aircraft as a precautionary measure. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, take your seats immediately. The woman across the aisle gasped. Someone 3 rows up started praying in Spanish. Daniel watched the Raptors with the trained eye of someone who'd flown beside them, beneath them, and once, during a joint exercise over Alaska, had outmaneuvered one in a split-second decision that ended with beers and grudging respect from its pilot. They weren't there for show. The angles were wrong, too aggressive, too close. This was an intercept posture, guns-hot positioning, the kind of formation you flew when you were prepared to put ordnance on target and live with the paperwork afterward. The radio crackled again, different voice, different aircraft. Venom lead, Sentinel. Target is non-responsive to all frequencies. Infrared shows normal passenger heat signatures. No anomalies in external profile. Recommend continuation of escort protocol to designated diversion field. Daniel's jaw tightened. They thought the plane was compromised. Hijacked, bombed, or worse. The passengers around him were starting to panic, the collective realization spreading like wildfire that military fighters didn't escort commercial aircraft over the homeland unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. A woman behind him called her husband, whispering that she loved him. The teenager was crying quietly. And Daniel Hargrove, who'd promised himself 6 years ago that he was done with this world, felt the old instincts rising like muscle memory too deeply embedded to forget. He reached for the call button. The flight attendant, young and visibly shaken, approached with the cautious steps of someone walking through a nightmare. Her name tag read Jessica. Her hands trembled. "Sir, please, we need everyone to remain. I need you to get a message to your captain," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command despite the denim jacket and reading glasses. "Tell him there's someone on board with tactical fighter experience. Tell him I can help." Jessica stared at him like he'd just claimed to be Superman. "Sir, I don't think. Tell him Viper 1 is on board. He'll understand." Her eyes widened. Maybe she was military adjacent. Maybe she dated a pilot. Maybe she just recognized the tone of someone who knew exactly what those raptors outside meant and wasn't asking permission anymore. She disappeared into the cockpit. The Raptors adjusted position, one sliding beneath the 737's belly, the other climbing to high cover. Standard box formation for an unknown threat. Daniel counted seconds, his breathing steady despite the chaos building around him. 30 passengers on this flight, not counting crew. 200 miles from Sacramento. The Raptors had enough fuel for maybe 40 minutes of escort before they'd need tanker support or replacement. Whatever was happening, whatever had triggered this response, it was escalating toward a decision point that nobody in this cabin wanted to reach. The cockpit door opened. The captain emerged, graying at the temples, wearing the weathered face of someone who'd spent 30 years behind the yoke. His eyes found Daniel immediately, and something passed between them, the recognition of one professional to another across the vast divide of circumstance. "Name and credentials," the captain said, no pleasantries, no time. "Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Hargrove, retired, 94th Fighter Squadron, 3,000 hours in F-22s, combat deployments Syria, Afghanistan, and classified Pacific operations, retired 2019. The captain's expression shifted fractionally. "Viper 1, Jesus Christ, I heard about you, that thing over the Strait of Hormuz." "That's classified," Daniel said evenly. "So is why you're retired at 38. They stared at each other. The captain made his decision. "We lost all external communications 4 minutes ago. Radio, transponder, data link, SATCOM, everything. The fighters showed up 90 seconds later. I can't talk to ATC, I can't talk to the military, and I've got 2 Raptors on my 6 treating me like a terrorist target. The co-pilot is former Air National Guard, but he flew C-130s. Whatever's jamming us, whatever's happening, we're flying blind into a situation that could end with those fighters putting missiles into this aircraft." Daniel stood, the movement fluid despite 6 years of domestic life. "They won't shoot without exhausting every option, but they're following protocols written after 9/11. You've got maybe 15 minutes before someone higher up the chain decides that whatever risk this plane represents outweighs the lives on board. Can you help?" Daniel looked out the window at the Raptors, at the sky that had once been his entire world, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "Get me into the cockpit, and find me something to write with. We're going to communicate with those fighters the old-fashioned way." The cockpit of Southwest 473 smelled like coffee and recycled air, and the particular tension that comes from knowing your aircraft is one wrong move from becoming a statistic. The co-pilot, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus with a C-130 background, yielded his seat without argument, understanding immediately that whatever credentials Daniel carried were enough for his captain. The instrument panel glowed with digital precision, but the radio stack showed only static across every frequency. Someone or something had turned this 737 into a flying ghost, invisible to the infrastructure designed to keep the skis safe and organized. Daniel slid into the right seat, his hands finding familiar positions on a completely different aircraft. "What's your fuel state?" he asked. 90 minutes, the captain replied. "We were supposed to land in 30. "Weapons status on the Raptors," Marcus answered from behind. "I counted 6 hardpoints between them, probably a mix of AMRAAMs and Sidewinders, but they won't go kinetic unless—" He didn't finish. Everyone in the cockpit understood unless. Daniel studied the fighters through the windscreen. The lead Raptor had pulled into parade position, close enough that he could see the pilot's helmet tracking their aircraft, the tiny movements of the stick-keeping station with surgical precision. "They're trying to get your attention," Daniel said. "Watch the lead." The Raptor waggled its wings, a gesture as old as aviation itself. Then its pilot pointed deliberately toward the southwest, the movement exaggerated and clear. Daniel smiled without humor. "He wants you to follow. There's a diversion field somewhere in that direction, probably China Lake or Edwards. Somewhere they can isolate this aircraft and figure out what the hell is going on." "I'm not flying this plane into a military base with 300 passengers," the captain said flatly. "You don't have a choice. Look at your fuel, look at your options. That pilot out there is giving you a way out that doesn't involve forcing his hand." The radio crackled with burst static, then cleared for a single second. A voice, female, cutting through with perfect diction. "Southwest 473, if you can hear this transmission, acknowledge by rocking wings." Daniel's hand moved to the yoke before the captain could react. He rocked the 737 gently, the movement visible but not dangerous. The Raptor pilot responded by pulling ahead, creating separation. The female voice returned, stronger now, fighting through whatever interference plagued their systems. "Southwest 473, we have intermittent contact. You are being affected by electromagnetic interference from unknown source. Multiple aircraft in your vicinity are experiencing similar communications degradation. This is not a hostile act against your specific flight. Repeat, this is not a hijacking scenario. We are escorting you to Edwards Air Force Base for emergency landing and systems evaluation. If you understand, acknowledge by turning 10 degrees right." Daniel released the yoke. The captain took it, his knuckles white, and executed the turn with the smoothness of decades of experience. The Raptors adjusted their formation, maintaining perfect position. "Who is that?" Marcus asked, leaning forward. "That's Sentinel," Daniel said quietly. "The airborne command element. They wouldn't put her on frequency unless this was bigger than just us. Her, Commander Maya Castellanos, call sign Paladin. If she's talking to commercial traffic directly, something's gone sideways enough to break about 15 different protocols." The captain glanced at him. "You know her. I trained her weapons school class 6 years ago, right before I retired." He didn't elaborate. Didn't mention that Maya had been the reason the Strait of Hormuz incident hadn't turned into an international crisis, that her decision-making under pressure had saved an aircraft carrier strike group from a coordinated drone attack, or that she'd sent him a handwritten letter when he'd submitted his retirement papers, thanking him for showing her what leadership looked like when the bullets were real. The radio cut in and out, fragments of transmission suggesting chaos across multiple frequencies. Daniel caught pieces about satellite communication failures, GPS anomalies, multiple aircraft affected across the western states. Then Maya's voice again, clearer this time. "All aircraft in Nevada, California airspace, be advised you are experiencing effects of solar geomagnetic storm creating unprecedented radio frequency interference. This is a natural phenomenon. Military escort is precautionary only. Remain calm. Follow ATC instructions when communications restore. Southwest 473, if you copy, rock wings again." The captain complied. Around them, the electromagnetic storm that had turned the sky into static began to clear, frequencies returning in bursts and waves. Daniel watched the Raptors maintain formation, professional and precise, and felt something shift in his chest that he'd thought was buried. The electromagnetic storm cleared like weather, gradually and then all at once, frequencies popping back to life across the radio stack in a cascade of relieved voices. Air traffic control re-established contact with Southwest 473, their questions rapid and procedural, confirming souls on board, fuel state, mechanical status. The captain handled it with the weary competence of someone grateful to return to normal operations, his shoulders finally unlocking from the tension that had turned him into a statue for 15 terrible minutes. The Raptors maintained formation for another 3 minutes, Then Maya Castellanos' voice came through one final time, official and crisp. Southwest 473, you are cleared to proceed on course to Sacramento International. Sorry for the excitement. Military escort is terminating. Safe flight. The lead Raptor pulled up and away in a climbing turn that showcased the aircraft's impossible thrust-to-weight ratio, a movement of pure power and grace. The wingman followed, both fighters disappearing into the high desert sun within seconds, leaving only contrails and the slowly settling adrenaline of 300 passengers who just brushed against something most people never experience. Daniel stood to leave the cockpit. Marcus caught his arm. That thing you did. Whatever you said that got us taken seriously instead of shot down, thank you. I didn't do anything. The storm cleared. They were always going to wait. Bullshit, the captain said without turning around. I've been flying for 32 years. I know the difference between protocol and someone calling in a favor they didn't know they had. Whatever your call sign means, whatever you did before you became a single dad in 12F, it just saved this flight from becoming a case study in what happens when communications fail during a national security event. Daniel pulled his arm free gently. I just told them who I was. They did the rest. He returned to seat 12F, settling back into the narrow space like nothing had happened. His hands shook slightly when he picked up the Korean War paperback, so he folded them in his lap instead and watched the Nevada landscape slide past below. Other passengers were talking now, speculation building about what had really happened, theories ranging from reasonable to absurd. The teenager behind him was telling someone on the phone it was definitely aliens. The businessman across the aisle was already drafting a complaint email about lack of information. Jessica, the flight attendant, stopped beside him during her post-crisis cabin check. She crouched down to eye level, her voice low enough that neighboring passengers couldn't hear. The captain wanted me to tell you that if you're ever traveling through Phoenix again, drinks are on him, and he wanted me to give you this. She pressed a business card into his hand. United Airlines, Captain Robert Chen, with a personal cell number written on the back. He said you'd understand what it means. Daniel pocketed the card without looking at it. Tell him I appreciate the gesture, but I'm retired. He said you'd say that too. He said to tell you that guys like you don't really retire, you just take leave until the sky calls you back. She stood, moved on to check on the still shaken passengers, leaving Daniel alone with that observation hanging in the air like turbulence. He watched the contrails dissipate above, knowing that somewhere up there Maya Castellanos was flying back to her command post, probably already buried in paperwork explaining why she'd broken protocol to directly communicate with commercial traffic. She'd face questions, maybe consequences. She'd done it anyway because that's who she was, who he'd helped train her to be. Someone who bent rules when lives were at stake and accepted the fallout afterward. The plane began its descent into Sacramento 20 minutes later. The landing was smooth, the taxi uneventful. Passengers filed off with the grateful shuffling of people ready to forget and move on, to return to their small dramas and normal lives. Daniel waited until the end, letting the crowd clear, then gathered his carry-on with the Spider-Man lunchbox and the unsigned permission slip. At the gate, his ex-wife Jennifer waited with Emma, who spotted him immediately and came running with the fearless enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned that the world was dangerous. He caught her, lifted her, held her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to Earth. "Daddy, Mommy said your plane had an adventure. Just some weather, sweetheart. Nothing exciting." Jennifer watched him over Emma's head, her expression unreadable. They'd been divorced for 4 years, separated for 6, the marriage another casualty of choices made in cockpits and ready rooms when the mission mattered more than the vows. She'd never understood why he'd walked away from flying right when he'd made lieutenant colonel, right when the assignments were getting prestigious and important. She'd thought it was for Emma. It was, partially. But standing there in Sacramento International with his daughter chattering about her science project, and his ex-wife's eyes asking questions she'd stopped voicing years ago, Daniel Hargrove knew Jennifer had been wrong about his reasons. He hadn't left the Air Force because flying was dangerous or demanding. He'd left because he'd looked at himself in the mirror one morning after a classified mission over the South China Sea and hadn't recognized the man staring back. Had seen someone who'd become so good at violence in 3 dimensions that he'd started making calculations about acceptable losses while eating breakfast cereal. He'd left because Emma had asked him why he looked sad all the time, and he hadn't had an answer that made sense to anyone, especially himself. The drive to his apartment was filled with Emma's constant narration, her world blessedly uncomplicated by fighter escorts and electromagnetic storms and the weight of experience. Jennifer followed in her own car to drop off Emma's overnight bag, maintaining the careful distance their custody arrangement required. At his apartment complex, she lingered by her vehicle while Emma ran inside to pick her bedroom and claim her territory for the weekend. "You okay?" Jennifer asked, the first personal question she'd asked in months. "Why wouldn't I be? Because I saw the news. They're saying there was some kind of solar event that knocked out communications across 3 states. They're saying military fighters scrambled to escort commercial planes. They're saying it was the biggest aviation crisis since 9/11 that nobody heard about because it resolved before the media could make it a disaster." Daniel leaned against her car, suddenly tired. "Then it resolved. Everyone's safe. Were you on one of those planes?" He met her eyes, seeing the woman he'd married when they were both too young to know better, when his dreams of flying had seemed romantic instead of obsessive. "Yeah, and nothing. Storm cleared, fighters went home, everyone landed safely." She studied him with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to read him across years of half-truths and operational security. "You did something, I can tell." "I sat in seat 12F and read a book about Korea. That's all." "Liar." She said it without heat, almost fondly. "That thing you do when you're forcing yourself not to move, not to act, not to be who you used to be. You were doing it right now, just standing here. Something happened up there that reminded you why you can't ever really stop being Viper 1, no matter how many juice boxes you pack." Daniel pushed off the car, done with the conversation, done with being read like an operations manual. "I need to make dinner. Emma wants tacos." "Dan," Jennifer's voice stopped him, "if you ever decide to go back, to fly again, to be that person you were before you chose us, I won't fight you for custody. Emma deserves a father who's whole, not half present and pretending he's satisfied with bedtime stories when he's dreaming about the sky every night." It was the most honest thing she'd said to him in 6 years. He didn't know how to respond, so he nodded once and headed inside, where Emma was building a blanket fort in the living room and asking if they could watch a movie about airplanes. They made tacos together, Emma standing on a stool to help with the lettuce, cheese scattered across the counter like confetti. He signed the permission slip for her field trip to the Science Museum. He helped with weekend homework, reading a paragraph about the water cycle while she illustrated it with careful crayon strokes. He built the blanket fort to her exact specifications, using couch cushions as support pillars and his Air Force Academy blanket as the roof, not missing the irony. They watched a Pixar movie about a crop duster who wanted to race, Emma laughing at the jokes while Daniel saw only the technical inaccuracies and missed the point entirely until she leaned against him and said, "That plane is like you, Daddy. He used to do something really brave. He was just a crop duster, honey. But he saved everyone, like you probably did today even though you won't tell me." She was 7. She shouldn't have been that perceptive. He kissed the top of her head instead of answering, and they finished the movie in silence while the sky outside his window darkened, and the stars emerged, distant and cold, and calling to something he'd thought he'd successfully buried. After Emma fell asleep in her room, surrounded by stuffed animals and nightlights shaped like rockets, Daniel stood on his balcony and looked up at the blackness dotted with navigation lights from commercial traffic stacking for landing at Sacramento International. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, then saw the text message. "Still got it, Viper. When you're ready to stop playing house and remember who you are, call me. Air Force needs people who can think under pressure when systems fail. Maya." He deleted the message, then recovered it from deleted items, then stared at it for 5 minutes before locking his phone and going inside. The weekend passed in the mundane rhythm Daniel had built over 6 years of part-time fatherhood. Saturday morning pancakes with chocolate chips arranged in smiley faces. A trip to the park where Emma played on equipment that seemed designed to test his heart rate more than her coordination. An afternoon at the library where she checked out books about space exploration, and he pretended not to notice the titles were about pilots and astronauts and people who'd chosen the sky over everything else. Sunday morning church service that he attended more for the structure than faith, sitting in the back pew while Emma fidgeted beside him, and the pastor talked about finding purpose in service to others. Lunch at the diner where they knew his order and Emma always asked for extra whipped cream. The return trip to Jennifer's house at exactly 5 o'clock per their agreement, Emma protesting she didn't want the weekend to end. Jennifer's sympathetic smile that somehow made Daniel feel like he'd failed at something fundamental. Alone again in his apartment Sunday night, Daniel opened his laptop to check his email and found 3 messages that shouldn't have been there. The first was from Captain Robert Chen, the 737 pilot, forwarding a commendation he'd submitted to Southwest Airlines recommending Daniel for recognition. Daniel deleted it without reading past the second paragraph. The second was from Marcus, the co-pilot, including an invitation to a private pilot gathering in Reno next month. Daniel marked it as read and moved on. The third was from an address he didn't recognize, but the subject line read Strait of Hormuz, and that was enough to make his hand hover over the delete button for several seconds before curiosity won. The email contained no text, only a photograph. An F-22 Raptor on the deck of an aircraft carrier, impossible and surreal, the fighter's landing gear straining under the weight on a platform never designed for tactical aircraft. The tail number matched Daniel's old bird. Below the image, a single line of text. Turns out what you proved that day keeps proving useful. Thanks for showing us impossible is just policy we haven't updated yet. You're missed. RADM Morrison. Daniel closed the laptop harder than necessary. He'd spent 6 years building walls against that life, creating routines that had nothing to do with tactical employment of air superiority fighters or the calculus of combat decisions. He'd become the man who packed juice boxes and signed permission slips. He'd chosen ground over sky, certainty over adrenaline, presence over glory. And yet, Monday morning, he called in sick to the software company where he worked in technical support, a job that used approximately 3% of his cognitive capability and paid just enough to cover child support and rent. He drove 2 hours south to Castle Air Museum, a sprawling collection of retired military aircraft sitting in the Central Valley heat like memories made physical. The museum was mostly empty on a weekday morning. Retired veterans volunteered as docents, leading small groups of school children through the static displays, explaining weapons systems and combat doctrine to kids who thought war was something that happened in movies. Daniel paid admission and walked among the aircraft alone, each one triggering memories that felt simultaneously ancient and immediate. An F-4 Phantom that looked like his grandfather's war. An A-10 Warthog that reminded him of joint operations over Afghanistan, where close air support meant the difference between victory and body bags. An F-15 Eagle that had been the premier air superiority fighter before the Raptor made it obsolete. He stopped in front of the F-22 display, touching the weathered metal of an early production bird that had flown its last mission before Daniel had even entered the academy. The aircraft looked smaller than he remembered, less threatening on the ground, its angles and edges designed by mathematics and purpose rather than aesthetics. A placard explained its capabilities in sanitized language: maximum speed classified, combat radius classified, weapons load classified. Everything that made the Raptor lethal reduced to words that meant nothing to civilians and everything to the people who'd flown them. "You look like someone who knows this bird." The voice came from behind him. Daniel turned to find an older man, maybe 70, wearing a veteran's cap with F-15 patches. His face carried the particular weathering of someone who'd spent decades at high altitude, squinting into sun and pushing machinery past design limits. "I read about it," Daniel said neutrally. Bullshit. I can spot a fighter pilot at 100 yards. It's in the way you look at the aircraft, not like a machine, like a partner you trusted your life to. Daniel smiled slightly. What gave me away? The fact that you've been standing here for 10 minutes and haven't looked at the placard once. You already know everything it says and about 40 things it doesn't. So either you're an engineer who designed this thing or you flew it. And engineers don't look at planes the way you're looking at that Raptor. They stood together in companionable silence. Two men separated by generations, but connected by the specific gravity of experience that came from strapping into aircraft designed to operate at the knife edge of physical possibility. The veteran, who introduced himself as Colonel Raymond Walsh, retired, had flown F-15s during Desert Storm, back when air superiority meant something different and the threat environment hadn't yet evolved into the distributed networked nightmare of modern contested airspace. Miss it? Walsh asked. Every day. You. Hourly. But my knees gave out and my vision went to hell, and the Air Force decided they'd rather have young hotshots than old wisdom. Standard progression. You, though. You're what, late 30s, should still be flying. Life got complicated. Life's always complicated. Question is whether you're complicated in a cockpit or complicated behind a desk. One of those feels like living, the other feels like slowly dying while pretending you're fine. Daniel laughed without humor. You sound like my ex-wife. Smart woman. Fighter pilots are shit at marriage but good at recognizing when we're lying to ourselves. So what's your story? What pulled you from the sky? Daniel considered lying, considered the comfortable fiction he'd built about choosing fatherhood and work-life balance and all the reasonable-sounding phrases people used when they quit things that had defined them. But something about standing in front of this Raptor, talking to someone who'd lived a parallel version of his life, made dishonesty feel exhausting. I got too good at it, he said quietly. At flying. At killing. At making calculations where human lives became variables in equations about mission success. At compartmentalizing enough that I could watch gun camera footage of direct hits and feel satisfaction instead of horror. I looked at myself one day and realized I'd become someone my daughter shouldn't meet. Walsh nodded slowly. The Strait of Hormuz thing. I heard about it through the network. Nobody says your name, but everyone knows the story. Single F-22 against a coordinated drone swarm targeting the carrier group. You held the line for 8 minutes until the CAP could establish air superiority. 41 confirmed kills with guns and missiles. They're still using your tactical decisions in weapons school as case studies in dynamic threat assessment. It's classified, Daniel said automatically. Son, everything interesting is classified. Doesn't mean we don't talk about it. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter. You saved 3,000 sailors that day, made decisions in seconds that admirals study for months. That's not something to run from. Daniel turned away from the Raptor, suddenly needing distance from the conversation and the memories and the shape of a life he'd thought he'd successfully abandoned. I watched the gun camera footage afterward, he said. 41 drones, each one programmed with a specific target on that carrier. Each one carrying explosive payloads designed to penetrate deck armor. I destroyed them with precision and efficiency, and when it was over I felt nothing except satisfaction at the intercept percentages. Like I'd just completed a video game level. That's when I knew I was broken. Walsh caught up with him near the museum exit. You weren't broken. You were doing the job exactly the way it needs to be done. Emotion in combat gets people killed. You think every surgeon feels anguish cutting into flesh. You think every police officer questions every shoot decision. We train people to suppress emotion during crisis because that's how you save lives. The problem isn't that you didn't feel. The problem is you expected yourself to feel the wrong things at the wrong time. I have a daughter. I can't be that person and be her father. Why not? You think she wants a father who's half alive and pretending satisfaction, or a father who's whole and honest about who he is. Kids aren't stupid. She knows you're not happy. She knows you're faking it. The only question is whether you're teaching her that's what life looks like, or whether you're showing her that courage means being who you actually are even when it's complicated. Daniel pushed through the museum doors into the parking lot, the Central Valley heat hitting him like a physical weight. Walsh followed at a respectful distance, giving space but maintaining presence. "How do you do it?" Daniel asked. "How do you reconcile who you were with who you are now?" Walsh smiled, the expression carrying decades of experience. "I don't. I'm still that fighter pilot. I'm just a fighter pilot who volunteers at museums and tells stories to grandkids and lives a life that includes other things besides flying. You don't stop being what you are. You just expand the definition to include more. You didn't stop being Viper 1 when you became a father. You just became a father who's also Viper 1. The question is whether you're honest about both parts or whether you keep trying to kill one to make room for the other." They shook hands in the parking lot. Walsh pressed a business card into Daniel's palm, much like the captain had done on the airplane. "Instructor positions at Nellie's. Weapons school needs people who have seen real combat to train the next generation. Steady schedule, home every night, salary that'll cover child support with room to spare. Think about it. Stop wasting your cognitive capacity on tech support when you could be keeping pilots alive." Daniel drove home through the afternoon heat, Walsh's words echoing in his head like weapons system alerts he couldn't silence. The instructor position made sense in every practical way. Regular hours, respectable salary, using his experience without the operational tempo that had slowly ground him down, teaching instead of doing, passing on knowledge without risking his life or his mental health or his relationship with Emma. But something about it felt like surrender. Like admitting he couldn't handle the real thing anymore, so he'd take the safe version. Like being the crop duster in the movie Emma loved, flying the same field day after day while telling himself it was enough. His phone rang while he was stopped at a light in Tracy. Maya Castellanos, her name appearing on the screen like a test he hadn't studied for. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Viper," Maya's voice carried the efficiency of someone calling between briefings. "Don't hang up. I've got 2 minutes before I'm due in a conference with NORTHCOM about last Friday's electromagnetic incident. Commander Castellanos, congratulations on your promotion. Don't bullshit a bullshitter. You knew I made commander 3 years ago. Cut the formality and listen. That solar event last Friday wasn't entirely solar. Someone was testing electromagnetic pulse weapons in the upper atmosphere. Someone who wanted to see what happens when our communication infrastructure fails across multiple states simultaneously. The solar storm gave them cover, perfect deniability. And now we've got gaps in our response protocols that are making people at very high levels extremely nervous." Daniel pulled into a gas station parking lot, suddenly needing stillness. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because we need people who can think clearly when systems fail. People who can make tactical decisions without waiting for clearance from chain of command. People who understand that sometimes the enemy's best weapon is turning our own caution against us. People like you. I'm retired. You're on leave. There's a difference. Look, I'm not asking you to jump back into a cockpit tomorrow. I'm asking you to consult. Analysis. Red team planning. Gaming out scenarios where our technology advantages disappear and we're back to basic airmanship and tactical instinct. 3 days a month, contractor rates, no deployment requirement, no active duty obligation, just your brain and your experience and your ability to see problems before they become casualties. I have a daughter. I know, single custody arrangement every other weekend plus Wednesday dinners. I did my homework. This doesn't interfere with that. This is 3 days a month at Nellie's, sometimes remote. Emma won't even notice except your bank account looks healthier." Daniel closed his eyes, seeing the trap forming with perfect clarity. Start with consulting. Get drawn back in gradually. 3 days becomes a week, becomes full-time, becomes deployment rotations, becomes everything he'd walked away from. What's the real agenda here, Maya? The real agenda is that on Friday I watched a scenario play out where we almost shot down a commercial airliner because our communication systems failed at the worst possible moment. I had 70 seconds to make a decision about 300 lives based on incomplete information and degraded situational awareness. The only reason everyone walked away is that I remembered something you taught our class at weapons school about maintaining tactical flexibility when the technology fails. You said the machine is just transportation. The real weapon system is the pilot's decision-making under pressure. I was younger and stupider when I said that. You were right when you said that. And now people who have never experienced combat are writing protocols based on assumptions that break the moment someone introduces chaos. We need your chaos, your ability to adapt, your experience making calls when everything's on fire and the textbook answer is wrong. So stop hiding behind your daughter and your guilt and your comfortable mediocrity and do something useful before someone else has to make decisions you could have prevented. The line went dead. Classic Maya. Say the uncomfortable truth, then leave no room for debate. Daniel sat in the gas station parking lot for another 15 minutes, watching ordinary people fuel ordinary vehicles on their way to ordinary destinations. A mom with 3 kids fighting in the backseat. A teenager practicing parallel parking while her father white-knuckled the passenger seat. A businessman talking loudly on his phone about quarterly projections. Normal life. The life Daniel had chosen. The life that felt increasingly like a costume that didn't fit anymore. He drove home, microwaved leftover tacos for dinner, watched news coverage of Friday's electromagnetic incident, now being explained as a once-in-a-century solar event that happened to coincide with unusual atmospheric conditions. No mention of testing, no suggestion of enemy action, just nature being dramatic and systems working exactly as designed. Lies wrapped in technicality delivered with confidence by people who didn't know better. His laptop sat on the coffee table, Maya's earlier text still recovered in his messages. Walsh's business card next to it. Captain Chen's email in his inbox. 3 different invitations back to a life he'd rejected. 3 different pathways to the same destination. He opened a new browser tab and searched for instructor positions at Nellie's. The posting was legitimate. Competitive salary. Clear schedule. Teaching curriculum design for weapons school qualification courses. Everything Walsh had promised. The application required military records, flight hours, combat deployment history, security clearance status, and references from active duty personnel. Daniel had everything except the last item. His references were 6 years out of date, retired themselves or moved to civilian sector jobs, no longer part of the network that made recommendations matter. He closed the laptop, made coffee, stood on his balcony watching Sacramento's light pollution drown the stars, thinking about electromagnetic weapons and communication failures, and the specific terror of being blind in the sky while everyone assumed you were a threat. His phone buzzed. Jennifer's name this time. Emma wants to video chat before bed. Can you take the call? He answered the video call 30 seconds later, Emma's face filling the screen with the particular enthusiasm of bedtime delay tactics. Daddy. Guess what I learned in science today? What did you learn, sweetheart? Mrs. Patterson said the sun had a solar storm last week and it made all the radios stop working. She said it was like when you put your phone in a microwave except the whole sky was the microwave. Did you know about that? I heard something about it. She said pilots had to fly without talking to anyone, just looking at each other and making signals with their wings, like sign language but for airplanes. Isn't that cool? Daniel smiled despite himself. Yeah, honey, that's exactly what they did. It's called visual communication. It's how pilots talk to each other before radios were invented. Could you do that if your plane's radio broke? I used to be pretty good at it. I bet you were the best. Mom says you were the best pilot in the whole Air Force before you decided to be the best dad instead. But maybe you could be both. The question hung in the air like turbulence. Jennifer appeared behind Emma, her expression carefully neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging, making space for Daniel to answer honestly without parental manipulation. Maybe, Daniel said. Maybe I could try, Emma grinned. Good, because my friend Sophia's dad is a firefighter and he says doing scary stuff makes you better at doing normal stuff because everything else seems easy after. I think that's true. You're really good at normal stuff, but you seem like you miss scary stuff sometimes. Get to bed, sweetheart. I'll see you Wednesday for dinner. Promise you'll tell me a flying story, a real one. Promise. The video call ended. Jennifer didn't call back with questions or observations, respecting the boundary they'd established. Daniel stared at his phone for a long moment, then opened his email and pulled up Walsh's contact information. The response came back within 5 minutes. Knew you'd come around. First step is updating your security clearance. I've already submitted the request. You'll need to pass a flight physical. Not a full return-to-flight workup, just current health status verification. Closest facility is Travis Air Force Base. I've got a contact there who